She won a war for him, secured his crown, and made him a true king. So when Joan of Arc was captured by the enemy, Charles VII did nothing to save her. He claimed he was too destitute. He allowed his courtiers to convince him that the woman who delivered his kingdom had outgrown her usefulness. He abandoned her to her fate. This is a story of that king and a teenage girl who saved him. It's a story of faith, prophecy, and war. But most of all, it's a story of a promise fulfilled and a trust betrayed. To understand why the king she created would abandon her, you must first understand the kingdom she was born into, a kingdom drowning in what she herself called the Great Pity of France. Her world was shaped by the 100 Years' War, a long and brutal conflict between France and England that had begun in 1337. By the time of Joan's birth, France was broken. The French military had suffered two devastating defeats, at Crécy in 1346 and more recently in Agincourt in 1415. The Battle of Agincourt was one of the single greatest demoralizers of the French cause. A vastly larger French army was demolished by the English bowmen of Henry V. This defeat reinforced the English claim that they were God's chosen heirs to the French throne. The kingdom was also rotting from within. A bitter civil war raged between the two noble factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The strife began with the assassination of Louis, Duke of Orleans, by the men of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, in 1407. France's own king, Charles VI, suffered from repeated bouts of insanity and could do nothing to unite his fractured kingdom. The crown prince, the Dauphin Charles, took it upon himself to avenge the murder of Orleans. His Armagnac forces killed the Duke of Burgundy in 1419. This act of revenge backfired spectacularly. It reinforced the alliance between the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, and Henry V of England. Worse, it cast doubt on the Dauphin's own legitimacy. His mother, Queen Isabel, was rumored to have had an affair with the murdered Louis of Orleans. By avenging Orleans so recklessly, the Dauphin behaved more like the son of his mother's lover than the son of his legal father, King Charles VI, jeopardizing his own claim to the throne. With the French kingdom weakened by internal division and demoralized by military defeat, England pressed its advantage. In 1420, with the approval of the Mad King Charles VI, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. The treaty disinherited the Dauphin Charles and named Henry V of England the rightful king of both France and England. To secure his inheritance, Henry married the Dauphin's own sister, Catherine of Valois. Discredited and disinherited, the Dauphin fled south to the town of Bourges, where he was mockingly called the King of Bourges. When both Henry V and Charles VI died in 1422, any hopes of the would-be Charles VII was extinguished. The Duke of Bedford, the chief power behind the English throne, ensured that his infant nephew, Henry VI, inherited both crowns. Alongside other English nobles like the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick, the Duke of Bedford and his burgeoning allies continued to conquer more of France. To preserve its sovereignty, France needed a military miracle to redress the ravages of Agincourt. That miracle would not come from a nobleman or a general. It would come from a teenage peasant girl who, at first, was only told by her visions to be good and to go to church. So how did a girl with simple instructions become the warrior who would crown a king? Into this desperate and divided France, Joan was born around 1412. She was the fourth child of Jacques d'Arc and Isabella Romy. Her father was a peasant farmer, influential in his village, but neither rich nor poor. Her devout mother provided her only schooling, teaching her the basics of prayer and the womanly art of sewing and spinning, at which Joan excelled. She learned scarcely any reading or writing. At the age of 12 or 13, while at her father's garden one summer afternoon, Joan heard the voices for the first time, accompanied by a great light. Her first vision was of Saint Michael, the archangel who had become the official protective saint of France. He was followed by visions of Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, two saints extremely popular in her devout and patriotic milieu. She did not need to read learned books to know of them. Their stories were part of the air she breathed. At first, the voices simply advised her to be a good girl. Gradually, they revealed her true purpose. She was one of the chosen to be the defenders of France, despite her youth, her gender, and her humble origins. Each of her three saints served as a model for her mission. Saint Michael was a dragon slayer, the celestial warrior. The legends of her two female saints provided a model for her virginity and for use of her male attire. Saint Margaret of Antioch was said to have disguised herself as a monk to elude marriage and preserve her virginity. Joan, too, would flee her parents' house to avoid marriage. She would don male attire to fulfill her destiny, using it as an overt, public sign of her divine designation and her obedience to her saints. Her other saintly guide, Catherine of Alexandria, heralded Joan's future eloquence. Saint Catherine was known for her dialectical expertise, having successfully debated 50 of a pagan emperor's most eminent philosophers and converted them to Christianity. Like Catherine, Joan would have used her words to win over skeptics and defend her faith against the most powerful theologians in the kingdom. Joan's uniqueness lay not in her ability to prophesize, but in the fact that she herself was prophesized. She understood with uncanny insight, for a minimally educated person, how to merge her own story with existing myths. One popular prophecy, attributed to Merlin, stated that a maiden would come from an oak forest to heal the kingdom. Joan capitalized on the fact that she was a maiden from Domremy, a village near the oak forest, to validate her mission. Another prophecy declared that France would be lost by a woman and saved by a warrior maiden. To Joan's public, the woman that lost France was Queen Isabel, whose rumored infidelity imperiled her son's succession. Joan, the warrior maiden, would be the one to save it. Her mission would begin in earnest when she traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. There, she finally won over the dismissive captain by correctly predicting the outcome of the Battle of Rouvroy, long before any official messenger could have delivered the news. Convinced, Captain Baudecourt provided her with the aid she needed for her long journey across France to meet the Dauphin as she known. But convincing a local captain was one thing. Now she needed to face a dispossessed and deeply skeptical royal court. And before she could prove herself to the Dauphin, she would first have to find him. When she arrived, Charles attempted to hide himself in the crowd, but she identified him immediately. In a private conversation, she managed to win his confidence by revealing a famous and still disputed secret. Whether it was a sign of their shared royal parentage or a special prophecy, it was enough to confirm his legitimacy in her own mind. Still, the Dauphin remained cautious and calculating. He ordered that Joan's prophetic claims be thoroughly questioned and verified by his leading theologians at Poitiers in March 1429. It was not enough for Joan to predict the future. Her examiners had to be certain that her visions came from God and not the devil. A key figure in this examination was Jean Gerson, the leading authority on the art of discerning false prophecies from true ones. Gerson wrote the most positive opinion of Joan, citing biblical heroines as precedent for her mission. With her prestigious support, the other examiners concurred, and her mission was approved. Once they determined her to be a true instrument of God, all her supposed aberrations, especially her male clothing, were deemed justifiable. Her words had convinced the theologians, but the theological approval meant nothing without victory on the battlefield. Now she had to prove that her words from God could be turned into military deeds. Having won the approval of the Poitiers examiners, Joan was finally approved to ride with the French army. She prepared for war, her authority now official. She even wrote to the monks at St. Catherine, requesting they unearth an ancient sword she clairvoyantly knew was hidden in their church, a sword she had never seen. Carrying the banner, she rode to Orleans. The city had been under a long and grueling English siege. On May 8, 1429, she led the French forces to a stunning victory, delivering Orleans from the English. This victory provided the validating miracle that was missing from the Poitiers examination, and it served as a powerful redress for the demoralized lost Anglecourt. Her victory at Orleans allowed her to write officially as what she claimed to be, the virgin defender of France sent by God. This powerful image attracted widespread support, most notably from the author Christine de Pizan, who saw Joan as a fulfillment of her own feminist and patriotic dreams. Of course, Joan's enemies saw her differently. Her Anglo-Burgundian detractors, including the Duke of Bedford, branded her a false saint, a harlot, and a bloodthirsty witch. Her letters from this period speak with the same force as her actions. First and the most important was the famous letter to the English, dictated in March 1429. In it, she introduced herself as La Pucelle, the maid, emphasizing her virginity to dispel any notion that she was a mere camp follower. Her tone was imperious, reflecting what she believed to be the infallible will of God. The letter was both a declaration of war and a peace proposal, contingent on a full English withdrawal. She faced the quandary of one Christian nation fighting against another by appealing to the English as their fellow Christians, inviting them to join a crusade against the infidel, calling it, quote, the most beautiful deed ever done for Christianity. The English, understandably, accepted neither the invitation nor her lopsided terms of peace. The letter's fiercely confident language disconcerted all who saw it, including the Duke of Bedford, who, despite his public mockery, clearly suspected she was no ordinary zealot. Following the victory at Orleans, Joan led the army on the march to Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. She sent missives ahead to the cities like Tournai and Troyes, demanding their submission to the Dauphin as king by God's command and requesting their support for her troops. She wrote a second letter to Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, seeking to make peace between him and Charles. She did so in uncompromising fashion, omitting any conciliatory mention of Charles's role in the murder of Philip's father, and justifying the proposed truce entirely as God's will. Her journey and the first part of her mission culminated on July 17, 1429. In Reims Cathedral, the dispossessed and discredited Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII. The peasant girl from Domremy had fulfilled her purpose. She had saved her king. This should have been the moment of her greatest triumph, but the king she created was a cautious and calculating man. And as Joan sought to press her advantage and drive the English from France, she would soon discover that her greatest enemy was not the English army, but the apathy of the court she had just secured. She sensed the new truce between Charles and Burgundy was an uneasy one, and she wrote to the people of Reims requesting their vigilance against any traitors. Her fears were well founded. Her later campaigns began to falter. The final betrayal came at Compiègne. On May 23, 1430, she was captured. The Dukes of Luxembourg's men sold her to Burgundy. Burgundy sold her to the English. After being held in a series of prisons, she was finally turned over to their allies at the Sorbonne and brought to trial in January 1431. And the king she saved did nothing. Charles VII, now secure on his throne, made no effort to rescue her. He offered no ransom. He had been convinced by his courtiers that she had outgrown her usefulness to him. The maid had served her purpose. Now she was a liability. Her trial was a masterpiece of political theater, following the proper legal forms to achieve a predetermined outcome. It was conducted by the pro-English bishop Pierre Cochon, a man acting in bad faith as a promoter for the English interests of Bedford and Warwick. In an echo of St. Catherine's legend, Joan faced 164 ecclesiastical judges and advisors. But unlike Catherine, Joan faced them without a single advocate for her own. The very records of her previous exoneration were twisted and used as a manual for her condemnation. For months, the judges hammered her with recurrent cycles of questioning, focusing on her voices, her male clothes, and her claims that God favored the French over the English. They feigned concern for her soul, trying to deceive her into renouncing her voices. Then they threatened her with torture. Joan's most dangerous assertion, in their eyes, was her refusal to submit to their authority as a church militant, the church on earth. She claimed her authority came directly from the church triumphant in heaven, represented by the saints. Convicting her as a witch would not only silence her, but it would also nullify the divine favor that had been confirmed by her victory at Orleans, thereby delegitimizing the very king she had crowned. Though she skillfully parried their attempts to entrap her into admitting to witchcraft, she was convicted of heresy and blasphemy. At one point, exhausted and under extreme pressure, her interrogators almost broke her. On May 24th, she signed a paper recanting her beliefs in her voices and promising to wear a dress to avoid being burned at the stake. Just 4 days later, on March 28th, she renounced the recantation. And in the eyes of her judges, she had just now relapsed into heresy. Her fate was sealed. She was handed over to the secular authorities and on May 30th, 1431, publicly burned at the stake of Rouen. But her story did not end in the fire. In the years that followed, the tide of the war turned, just as she had prophesied. By 1450, the English had been essentially expelled from France. Now that her prophecies were fulfilled and his reign was secured, Charles VII initiated the so-called Rehabilitation trial. After years of inquest, the original verdict was overturned on July 7, 1456. The proceedings noted the procedural errors at the Coronation trial and restored her good name. But while the rehabilitation purported to clear Joan's name, its more immediate and real intention was to improve the image of King Charles VII, who would go on to rule as Charles the Victorious. The king who had abandoned her in her moment of need now used her memory to solidify his own legacy. It was the final, cynical act in a story of profound betrayal. The church was slower to act. It was not until the 19th century that historians unearthed her trial records, editing and publishing them for all to see. The medieval courtroom drama, combined with the martyr's passion, captivated the world. Joan became an international cult hero, representing a multitude of causes. After the French soldiers in World War I reported having visions of her in the trenches, the church that had condemned her finally canonized her as a saint in 1920. The girl who called herself Joan the Maid has been claimed by many, but her story remains her own. It's the story of a minimally educated girl who understood the power of prophecy, a pious virgin who commanded armies, and a faithful daughter of the church who was condemned by its own judges. At its heart, it's the story of a king she saved and a king who abandoned her.